For Affluent Society, Social Change, I'm A.
And I'm M.
Rising living standards in the 1950s. In 1951, Britain's infrastructure was run down. There was a need for housing development after the housing stock and housing in general was damaged in the war. Task: how many houses did the Conservatives plan to build as one of their domestic policies in 1951? And who was the housing minister that oversaw this?
1. Pre-war slums were cleared and new towns were built, e.g. Harlow and Essex. 2. Towns built under Labour in the 1940s grew rapidly. However, shifts in population caused established traditional communities to disintegrate. This trend was intensified by the impact of private car ownership. Task: what other things would increase car ownership impact? Make a mind map.
In 1952, men's weekly wages went up from £8.30 in 1951 to £15.35 in 1961. There was an increase in private savings. From 1951 to 1964, there was uninterrupted full employment, while productivity increased faster than another period of comparable length in the 20th century. Total production increased by 40%, average earnings by 30%.
6. Home ownership increased because of 1. Easy to access to cheap mortgages, but people living in council houses/rented accommodation still largely outnumbered private homeowners. Task: why would people still be living in council houses if it was a time of great affluence?
Farmers. They did well economically, encouraged by the continuation of state subsidies, and food rationing also ended in 1954, which helped farmers out a lot.
The impact of affluence and consumerism. An obvious sign of new affluence was the surge in ownership of consumer goods. A visible symbol of this affluence was advertising, with the introduction of ITV in 1955. Surge in ownership of consumer goods, e.g. televisions, washing machines, refrigerators, and new furniture bought on hire purchase. ITV launched in 1955, known as glossy adverts.
Affluence enabled new leisure opportunities. Between 1957 and 1959, the number of households owning a television rose by 32%. By 1960, there were 10 million TV sets in use. 50% of the population watched TV in the evening. People had more time and money for hobbies encouraged by new television programs.
2. Affluence showed a boom in car ownership. Car ownership rose by 25% in 1957 and 1959. This created demand for new roads and motorways. Building of motorways began in 1958 with the first motorway, Preston Bypass. Car travel meant an increase in holidays, job opportunities, and housing development. In 1957 and 1963, 12,000 miles of roads were completed.
Holiday camps reached the peak of popularity. 60,000 holidayed each week with Butlins, and foreign holidays were a luxury enjoyed by only 2% of the population. Task: watch this video on Butlins.
Class and the establishment. In 1951, Britain was a deferential and conformist society, respected for authority and had solid class loyalties. For example, at the 1951 election, 65% of working class voters voted Labour, 80% of the middle class voted Conservative. Task: Churchill was in office from 1951 to 1955. Who was Prime Minister after him, and until what date?
But there was a shift in attitudes. There was a breakdown of social restrictions due to the Suez Crisis in 1956, which exposed blatant lying of the government, and the rise of the CND from 1958, which encouraged challenging authority. Britain became less conformist as a society. So, what was the establishment? It was the informal networks that connected the social and political elites, also known as the Old Boys Network.
2. Press coverage of the Profumo affair showed previous tactics used by government to prevent the publication of sensitive or embarrassing information no longer worked. Task. The Profumo affair happened in 1961. Write down all you can remember about it.
In 1960, there was a satire boom. For example, in 1962, the TV show That Was the Week That Was made its debut, satirising public figures. The satire boom, for example, the first performance of Beyond the Fringe on the 22nd of August 1960, ended around December 1963 with the cancellation of a TV show That Was the Week That Was. The figures most closely identified with it are Peter Cook, John Bird, John Fortune, David Frost, and Bernard Levin and Richard Ingrams. The boom was driven by well-connected graduates from first the University of Cambridge and then the University of Oxford. Historian Booker argues satirists were driven by failure of the Suez debacle, Britain's shrinking position in world affairs. The Labour Party was proving to be ineffective opposition to a patrician Conservative government. The satire boom generation were in general a political, or had, at the time, left-of-centre tendencies. At the same time, the emergence of angry young men and kitchen sink realism in drama were signs that the democratisation of British culture was increasingly dominated by the concerns of the common man.
4. People criticising the establishment believed it was holding back Britain, believed that the ruling elite favoured arts education over science, blocked talent from outside the establishment, and hid its own mistakes. 1951 to 1964, Conservative government was dominated by the establishment. Macmillan's government included a duke, baron, marquess, and 3 earls. Britain was described as class-ridden society. In 1958, he was related to 35 members of his government by marriage, including 7/9 of his cabinet. Even the most prominent spokesman of the Labour Party had an elitist education, the mid-1960s. Social scientists Hogarth, The Use of Literacy, 1957, and Sampson, The Anatomy of the Brain, 1961, provided evidence that Britain was class-ridden society with entrenched attitudes and the lack of social mobility. Task. Macmillan was Housing Prime Minister in 1951. What other roles did he have?
Why was the establishment criticised? Macmillan's government. Reginald Moulding was Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1961. Rab Butler was Chancellor of the Exchequer 1951, Home Secretary 1957, Foreign Secretary 1963. Lord Hailsham was Party Chairman and Leader of House in 1963. Alex Douglas Home was Foreign Secretary from 1960 and Prime Minister in 1963.
5. Later on, the belief was Britain needed leaders who had earned their positions, understood the modern technical age. Late 1950s, there were a group of writers who used the arts to attack the behaviour and attitudes of the upper and middle classes. These were known as the angry young men. E.g., a play staged in 1956, Look Back in Anger, did just this, by John. Still, the class system was not broken. The establishment angry young men writers, depicting working class life, a group of middle class men showing nostalgic traditionalism, modern mass culture shallow, destructive and debased, never had any clear political agenda, and a reflection of contemporary society which was anti-establishment.
Position of women. Women were seen as housewives in the 1950s, primarily a wife and a mother. Women's lives tended to be dominated by looking after children, cleaning, cooking, shopping and laundry. Labour politician Stafford Cripps let it be known that in austere economic climates he expected women to behave with responsibility and by not seeking new freedoms. Task. Is this evidence of change or continuity?
Continuity. The average age of marriage was 21. 75% of all women were married. Only 1 in 5 of women went out to work in 1951. Family allowance was there to ensure women didn't need work. Welfare state was based on the nuclear family and full employment for men. Mortgages were in men's names and bank accounts, so women were financially dependent on their husbands. Divorce was only permitted on the grounds of adultery, cruelty, or desertion. The divorce rate was extremely low in the 1950s, only 2.5 per 100,000 married couples. However, it was increasing. Barely 1 in 10 of the higher posts in the legal profession, the civil service, and universities were held by women, and the government encouraged women to stay at home with a payment to the mother of family allowance for any children after their first.
Women had started to work, but 1964, the number of women working had increased, but work was uncommon for married women. Trade unions tended not to support women because there was a belief that working mothers were damaging for children. By 1960, women made up 1/3 of the workforce, but 2/3 of the jobs they held were in low-paid secretarial roles.
Change. In middle classes, there was equal pay for teachers in 1952 and civil servants in 1954. Introduction of labour-saving devices improved women's lives in the home. Between 1957 to 1959, the number of households with a washing machine rose by 54% and fridges by 58%. Labour-saving devices gave women more free time. Second-wave feminism, women trapped as homemakers, wouldn't spread from the USA to Britain until the 1960s. Task. Labour-saving devices and the end to rationing in 1954 gave women more free time and liberated them. But how could this be a negative?
Attitudes to immigration and racial violence. At the Queen's coronation in 1953, there was enthusiasm for the Commonwealth ideal. The new Commonwealth were immigrants who followed after Empire Windrush in 1948. This caused social change and tensions. There's a key there if you'd like to use that for the rest of the video.
1. In 1948, Windrush brought 250,000 immigrants. By 1958, 210,000 Commonwealth immigrants had settled in Britain. 75% were male. The 1948 British Nationality Act meant Commonwealth citizens would be welcomed as equals in Britain. Cheap flights from Hong Kong, 5,000 to 50,000 immigrants arrived in a period of 20 years. Task. Why would most of the 210,000 immigrants who had settled in 1958 be male?
Public attitudes were mixed, and there was a general tolerance and attitude of getting along. Authorities thought immigration was economically desirable because immigrants filled low-wage jobs. The breakup of the empire and decolonisation meant that there was a backlash of violence that many immigrants were escaping. The British government actively encouraged immigration through propaganda posters and recruitment drives on behalf of national organisations like the NHS and London Transport, who took on 4,000 employees from Barbados. The Royal Commission on Population reported that in 1949 that immigrants of good stock would be welcomed without reserve. A time of affluence. Britain's economy was booming. Plenty of jobs for unskilled workers were available, particularly in textile factories. Wages were far higher than in their own countries.
3. There was outwards migration, with 1.32 million Britons seeking life abroad. In the 1950s, with 676,000 seeking permanent residence in England. By the 1960s, inward migration was 1.25 million, with outward 1.92. A tough new US immigration law introduced in 1952 restricted access to the USA. Former colonial countries had been taught that Britain was a land of opportunity, the mother country. Task: what would the immigration law both prevent and encourage?
Racial tensions rose, however. In 1958, the Notting Hill riots broke out. So, the Notting Hill riots and their consequences. At the end of 1958, there were outbreaks of violence. The area was run down and tenants were overcrowded. The police were unprepared and had a lack of experience, and there was youth violence from the Teddy Boys. Task: watch this video for more information on the Notting Hill riots.
6. British fascist leader Oswald Mosley used the riots, standing in as Union Movement candidate in 1959 election for Kensington North. This included Notting Hill, on a platform for repatriation. Task: read this BBC article on Oswald Mosley.
As a result, racial violence brought attention to a problem politicians thought that they could avoid. In 1962, the Commonwealth Immigrants Act was introduced. This controlled immigration from countries with close historic links to Britain. Labour opposed the act but did not repeal it after the 1964 election.
The emergence of teenager and youth culture. During the 1950s, the idea of a teenager emerged for the first time. This was because
young people had more time. Labour-saving devices meant girls had more free time as they didn't have to help at home as much. Boys no longer had to take part in national service after 1960. Task: between 1957 to 1959, how many households had a washing machine? 58 or 54?
2. The baby boom meant more people. In 1959, there were 5 million teenagers in Britain. This was 10% of the population. 3. Changes in style. People dressed differently to their parents, listened to different music, and went to coffee bars. 4. They were more visible and economically important. They had money to buy records and fashion. This created a youth culture as more programs and devices were aimed at them.
An example of a youth subculture was the Teddy Boys from the early 1950s. They were seen as juvenile delinquents. Some key details of these were they were money-focused, had Edwardian clothes, saw themselves as superior, the focus on the clothes especially, and hair in girls, linked with juvenile delinquency and rising crime, and were seen as a challenge to older ages. They challenged ideas about social order, and their clothing in particular was depicted by long coats, narrow trousers, and Edwardian dress sense. Conflicts. They were seen as a challenge to the older ages due to their ideas about social order. They were linked with rising crime, and they were linked especially to the Notting Hill riots of 1958.
The Teddy Boys were later replaced by mods and rockers. Rock and roll reached Britain in 1955 with Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, and later Elvis. Rockers rode heavy motorcycles, wore leather, and listened to rock.
But the mods rode scooters, wore smart suits, and preferred sophisticated pop music. Another task: watch this video on mods.
The mods and rockers often clashed. In the 1960s, one clash caused a national sensation. Large-scale organised riots in Clacton, Margate and Brighton, May 1964. The fighting lasted 2 days. The police struggled to restore order, and public reaction was moral panic and hysterical descriptions of knife-wielding hooligans. The actual levels of violence were vastly exaggerated. Task: watch this video.
Changing social attitudes and tensions. These changing social tensions were reflected in film. For example, A Clockwork Orange, made in 1962 by Anthony Burgess, portrayed gang violence, and TV produced campaigning programmes designed to raise controversy about social issues. For example, Kathy Come Home was a drama about homelessness by Ken Loach in 1962.
2. A drive to break down censorship. In 1962, Penguin's Books published a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover, an explicit novel by D.H. Lawrence, previously banned. The result was a high-profile court case under the Obscenity Act. Penguin won and produced 2 million copies. 3. New Culture wasn't universally popular. Backlash against immorality and depravity, led by Mary Whitehouse National Press. Overall, Britain remained socially conservative, however.
That's it. Thanks, guys.